What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, live today on Wednesday, August 28th, to bring you guys another great show, again, revolving around the latest NFL stories happening today and also over the past few days. A couple of the stories I have on store today are pretty interesting. I thought one of them being one of the Texans wide receivers, John Metchie, could be a candidate to be traded, according to NFL insider Jordan Schultz. There does seem to be a bit of interest in John Metchie, so I'll list out some potential fits and what this says about the Houston Texans in regards to John Metchie and any future plans they might have with him. Also, ESPN recently put out a survey on quarterback superlatives, let's say, and there were some pretty interesting reactions and feedback on some of those categories, like the top 3 quarterbacks, most overrated quarterback, most underrated quarterback, and I thought I'd give my reaction to those later on. And also, Sean McVay, the head coach of the Rams, designated his starting running back, Kyren Williams, as the team's #1 punt returner. Pretty unorthodox, so we're going to get into why Sean McVay did that and my thoughts on it as well, plus a couple more topics down the line in today's show. But before we get started on talking about John Metchie, as I always do on these shows, I'd like to remind you guys of this great opportunity that I have for you, because I always try to bring you guys some interesting topics, or at least what I find interesting across the NFL. And while all that might be great, I always love to hear what you guys have to say in any of my responses or on any of the topics on any of the shows. So to make sure to keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible, we have a new feature available for you guys. The Super Chat feature you guys can find at the bottom of the chat box just by clicking the $, like I said, at the bottom of the chat box to send in your Super Chat. This way, it makes it a lot easier for you guys to send in any questions, opinions, or just comments you have to make on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's just another way to keep the show more interactive and just more lively as we go on with these shows. And also, it guarantees that I see your message and I also say it out loud on air and just keep the conversation going in that way. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit the Super Chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and exciting as possible. It's a great way to support our channel and the content we put out as well. But as an alternative option, you still have the old method, the tip and donations link you could still use at gsmcpodcast.net with any comment or question you may have there. But again, we couldn't do this show without your amazing support, so go ahead and use that new Super Chat feature. And again, thank you guys in advance for all the support and being part of our community. But now, with that being said, jumping into the first segment on today's show, all revolving around one of the wide receivers, not one of the more popular ones, I think it's fair to say, because when you think of the Texans wide receivers, you think right away of Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins in the season that he had last year, and also Tank Dell with how exciting he got his NFL career going last year. It was unfortunate that he was sidelined with that injury, but I wanted to talk about and bring up another wide receiver, that being John Metchie for the Houston Texans. A lot of people might not know about him, but I wanted to bring you guys this topic because I think he is sort of a hidden gem type of talent, and the potential that he has, I think, is really just underrated in this sense. And the fact that he's on the Texans is almost just a plethora of options that they have on their roster. So yesterday, on Tuesday, the deadline to reduce the roster sizes for the NFL was one of the main things to happen, and obviously the Texans probably didn't have too many challenges in deciding who to keep at the wide receiver position, but it could become a little bit more interesting after the report by Bleacher Report's NFL insider Jordan Schultz, reporting on the level of interest in John Metchie by some of the more common teams we've talked about already in regards to the wide receiver market. And Jordan Schultz mentioned this in his report on John Metchie and the level of interest he is gaining. He said, multiple teams have reached out to the Texans to see if wide receiver John Metchie would be available in trade due to the plethora of receivers on their roster. It's unclear if Houston would move him, but several teams are keeping a close eye. And again, you might be thinking, who the heck is John Metchie, right? If you're not really following the NFL too much, or you don't really know him from college, John Metchie, I think this year really started to step into giving everybody a glimpse of the kind of receiver he can be, or the kind of receiver that people thought he could be coming out of Alabama, because just this offseason, in the preseason actually, he had recorded already 10 receptions for 100 yards and 1 touchdown, making a name for himself early on to kind of try and force his way into the rotation with, like I mentioned, all the options that the Texans have at that position. But, this is his third year now in the NFL, or it is going to be his third year, and the story around John Metchie and why it might seem a little bit late as to why he's, getting noticed just now is because he missed his entire rookie year after being diagnosed with leukemia. Then obviously he didn't play. Then last year, in his second year, it was more so beginning the process of getting used to everything in the NFL, playing in an actual game, going through the practices, recovery, all that sort of things. It's not easy, obviously, if you miss already the first opportunity to learn it in your official first year. Obviously, dealing with leukemia takes precedent over everything. So last year was really the year that he kind of started getting a feel for everything. But at that point, he was almost lost among the other receivers that they had. You'd think of Nico Collins breaking out last year, Tank Dell again bursting onto the scene as a rookie, and him trying to get it all wrapped up together. Not even just getting it all, understandably under wraps and getting used to his routine and everything like that, but also coming off of leukemia is something that is only unique to him. So he kind of got lost in everything. He only recorded 16 receptions last year, and now this year, you think about those two guys he was already competing with, and then on top of that, you add Stephon Diggs into the mix, right? You're not going to trade for Stephon Diggs and think that, in all honesty, that John Metchie is going to take away some reps from Stephon Diggs, right? Or else you wouldn't have made that trade if you felt comfortable enough with John Metchie being a prominent player in that rotation. So it seems a little bit murky right now with this situation with John Metchie and what his future could be with the Houston Texans, because, like I mentioned, all that potential he showed at Alabama, I was a fan of him coming out, and it was unfortunate that he was diagnosed with leukemia, but in that last year, in 2021, at Alabama, he recorded 96 receptions, 1,142 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And really, I feel like he should be playing more. I feel like he deserves more of an opportunity. And it's not an indictment against the Texans or anything like that. You just don't know in this day and age with wide receivers. And when you have such a great opportunity to go get Stephon Diggs, not a lot of teams would say, I'm good. Like, we're good with our wide receivers. If you have the opportunity to go get a guy like Diggs, almost every team in the league would go out and do it. So you can't really blame them for bringing Stephon Diggs over when that opportunity became available. But it seems like Houston is open to the possibility of keeping him and seeing what they have in him in the future. But on the flip side, do they, going with that long-term plan, do they decide to kind of shelve him a little bit more again in consecutive years? And then when Diggs, if he decides to leave after this year because he is still on his current contract, he is available to leave in free agency next year if the Texans don't decide to extend him, then do you allow Diggs to leave and sort of work John Metchie in at that point? But the downside of that is that because John Metchie was drafted in the second round, you don't have the extra year available to you if you're the Houston Texans to kind of put off those contract negotiations, right? Because this is going to be his third year, and then if you decide to kind of sideline him a little bit more because you already have 3 receivers, then next year you start to incorporate him a little bit more. Then you only really have that 1 year to determine what kind of contract you want to offer John Metchie after that. And I'm always of the mindset that you definitely need, obviously, more than 1 year to get a gauge on the type of player that you have, the kind of consistency and kind of projecting what he could be in the years to come if you're going to offer him a long-term deal. So if you're going to go that route, it does really only give you that 1 year with John Metchie really being incorporated in that lineup. Again, because I don't anticipate him being such a prominent player in this offense this year with Nico, Tank, and Stephon Diggs on the team now. So now with these reports of there being trade interest, the same teams keep popping up. The Steelers are one of the teams mentioned. The 49ers is an interesting one. If Brandon Ayuk decides to leave, they could explore that opportunity to bring in John Metchie. Also the Washington Commanders. But with those two teams, the Commanders and the 49ers, the Commanders actually signed a former Texans wide receiver, one of John Metchie's teammates, just last year, Noah Brown. They just signed him about an hour or so ago, so maybe that option is off the table. And also for San Francisco, with Ayuk, he could stay, he could leave. It changes every day. There was a report earlier, just 20 minutes ago, that Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch said that they expected Brandon Ayuk to practice today. That practice is already underway, and there is no sign of Brandon Ayuk, so take that as you will. It doesn't really say too much because it seems like when there's a new report, you take it one way and then it completely flips the other day. So take that information as you will. That's still a viable option, I believe, if Ayuk decides to leave, and the Steelers as well. Other than George Pickens, are you really comfortable with Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin III, Scotty Miller, and a rookie wide receiver in Roman Wilson? A lot of people would say no, so exploring this opportunity could be something that interests the Steelers. And you're only really looking at a couple of day 2, maybe day 3 picks because of the value that John Metchie was drafted in, and also the lack of playing time. You don't trade based on projection, really. Any team that is going to trade for John Metchie would have any sort of leverage in saying that the lack of playing time and things like that sort of benefit them. So it's something to keep an eye on, certainly, because I really do believe that Metchie could be a high-end, maybe low-end number 1 wide receiver, a high-end number 2 in the NFL, sort of like a Nico Collins, a Jalen Waddle, a Calvin Ridley, some of these guys that certainly have the talent to be number 1 receivers, and that you are content, more than content actually, if they happen to be your number 2. So that's how highly I rate John Metchie, and that's why I decided to bring it up on this show today to kick it off, just because I think this could be a great opportunity for someone to jump on John Metchie and really just improve their wide receiver room right away. But we'll see. A lot of chips, I think, have to fall before we see anything really develop, so we'll keep an eye on that as we move on. But the next topic I want to jump into after this upcoming break is this recent ESPN survey that was put out by ESPN, obviously, on different sort of categories that players in the NFL rated quarterbacks in, including the top 3 quarterbacks, most overrated quarterback, most underrated quarterback, and things like that. I wanted to bring it up and just my reactions to it, what some anonymous players had to say as to why they voted quarterbacks in these categories. So there were some pretty interesting rankings and some pretty surprising ones as well. So that is coming up after this break. A lot more to come on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back here to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast as we begin the second segment, and I thought this was pretty interesting based on how it all played out. Talking about the ESPN survey that came out a couple of days ago on these categories, superlatives, whatever you'd like to call it, on the current state of the quarterbacks across the NFL today. ESPN put out this survey to 100 plus NFL players to rank quarterbacks in different categories, like I said. Almost like if you've seen any of these who's most likely to videos, it sort of falls into that range of what kind of categories and content that was provided by this survey. So the categories that are in question are the top 3 current quarterbacks in the NFL, predicting the most successful rookie quarterbacks in this year's class, most overrated quarterback, most underrated quarterback, and biggest trash-talking quarterback to round it all off. 103 players from 25 different teams gave their input on this survey. Of course, they all remained anonymous, but there were certainly some interesting results from this survey. So we're going to start off with what I think is the most obvious one, in my opinion. The top 3 quarterbacks in the NFL, according to NFL players, sort of played out like I anticipated it to. Patrick Mahomes, number 1. Number 2 would be Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow in at number 3, based on the responses by current NFL players. It was all based off of a point system. First place votes got you 3 points, second place votes got you 2 points, and third place only got you 1 vote. And Patrick Mahomes was the resounding number 1 choice at 291 points, then Lamar Jackson at 124, and Joe Burrow at third place with 51 points. And the ones that followed after that were Josh Allen with 39 points and Aaron Rodgers, sort of surprising, with 32 points. And I think, like I said, it was the most obvious one. Not too many people wouldn't have put Patrick Mahomes at number 1. Lamar Jackson, just coming off of an MVP season, clearly the number 2, was ranked the number 2 player in the NFL Network's top 100 rankings, so this makes sense. And I think Joe Burrow, too, even though he had an injured-riddled season last year, the success that his team has, the Bengals, has when he does play, is pretty astounding. So seeing these 3 guys as the top 3, I didn't really have too much issue with it. So moving on to the next category, the most successful rookie quarterback, predicting who is going to be that most successful rookie quarterback in terms of the NFL players currently, sort of played out like this. Caleb Williams at number 1, not so much of a surprise. Jaden Daniels at 2, and then at number 3, J.J. McCarthy. And those 3 guys were followed up by Michael Penix and Bo Nix with the same amount of points. And what I found interesting, based on those top 5 names that I just listed out, that Drake May wasn't up there. I felt like maybe he could have been in at number 4. Honestly, he could have been at number 3, just in my opinion, just based on JJ being hurt and everything. Now, I did fail to see when they did take all of these votes. It could have been closer to the draft, but yeah, even still, a little surprised that Drake May was last, but I guess that does obviously have to do with the state of the New England Patriots, so that could have been a big thing, much like Caleb Williams being the resounding number 1, just because a lot of players mentioned that the Bears situation, adding Keenan Allen, adding DeAndre Swift, drafting Rome Odunze was a big part as to why they voted him number 1. One NFC South player brought up the fact that Jaden Daniels, being the face of the Washington Commanders essentially right now, and their new head coach and new owner, was something that they thought was exciting and a good situation overall for him and the Commanders. And it was interesting also, one of the points that was made by an NFC South player, just in regards to Caleb Williams, the amount of pressure that he has to deal with compared to everybody else. He sort of used the example of similarly comparing him to Patrick Mahomes, with all the hype build up around Caleb and how his play style is similar to Patrick. He said that if Caleb doesn't look like Patrick Mahomes out there, that type of pressure is way different than what people expect out of Jaden Daniels or Michael Penix or Bo Nix and things like that. That's the kind of expectations that Caleb has to deal with. So it is something to keep in mind, and it is something that I found fascinating and pretty accurate overall, just because all the amount of hype that Caleb has had to deal with already, everybody micro-analyzing everything he does on and off the field, it could get pretty heavy. And not a lot of people experience that, obviously, but not a lot of people deal with it in that same breath. So I thought that was an accurate point that I thought I'd share in this evaluation of it. But ranking them 1 through 3, this one was pretty accurate as well. Something that I probably would have came up with if I was asked to predict the most successful rookies. Then this is where it got a little interesting. This is where it got a little controversial for some people. The most overrated quarterback in the NFL, according to this anonymous survey, you see Josh Allen was voted as the most overrated. Jalen Hurts up there in at number 2, and Tua Tagovailoa rounding off that number 3 spot. Josh Allen and even Tua, I would say, probably the two most polarizing quarterbacks that we have in the NFL nowadays, because some people look at Josh Allen as the equal almost to Patrick Mahomes, or as close as you can get to Patrick, whereas other people just look at him as a turnover machine, not being able to get over that hump of being Patrick Mahomes, and sort of you have both groups just butting heads constantly. You know, Josh Allen, you're just not being able to beat the Chiefs, everyone holding that over his head. And similarly with Tua Tagovailoa, you know, drafted high, all this potential out of Alabama, but in the NFL, people criticize his arm, his limited athleticism, I guess you could say, and things like that. A lot of people mentioning that he's a system or a benefactor of Mike McDaniel's system with Miami, the weapons that he has around him as well. And that's sort of the same situation with Jalen Hurts, right? Because one NFC East player, yes, anonymous again, was quoted by saying regarding Jalen Hurts, he said, "How hard is it to throw a jump ball to A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith every time?" So it kind of encapsulates everything that comes with the criticism that Jalen Hurts has. People question his arm, his decision-making, and again, just being surrounded by a great team as to why he could be overvaluated or overrated in this sense by a lot of people. And again, with just some of these other comments that were made, one NFC West player brought up the fact that Josh Allen just has too many turnovers, and it is true in a sense. You know, you look at this stat, since 2008, Josh Allen is first in amount of turnovers that he has thrown with 102 since 2008. So he wasn't even close to being in the NFL by that time. So that does bring up a good point. But I think, you know, most overrated, I'm in the mindset of Josh. I hold Josh Allen to a high regard. I think he is truly one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL, and I can see why people send a lot of criticism his way, and that's not going to ease up now that Stephon Diggs is gone. If anything, it might get a little bit worse, and people might put more blame on Josh Allen if he's not able to drag his team over the finish line now, just based on the fact that everybody wants to compare him to Patrick Mahomes. Different situations, and I think Josh, more often than not, wins you games than really loses you games. You know, he does have some bad turnovers again, right? But, you know, the highs and the benefits that he does bring, I think, outweigh that, much like a bunch of other quarterbacks. So I don't really know why it's highlighted so much with Josh, but again, one of the most polarizing quarterbacks in the NFL, and this sort of highlights that in a nutshell pretty much. So that's how that played out. And the second to last one here, a little surprising to me as well, most underrated quarterback. Brock Purdy and Matthew Stafford actually had the same amount of points at 14. And then third place, I put Jordan Love there, but it was sort of a 4-way tie, or actually no, 3-way tie with Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, and Jordan Love getting the same amount of votes. So I put Jordan Love in there, but Kirk, Jared Goff were also in there, technically in at number 3 for the most underrated quarterback. And this one surprised me because I figured that Brock would be in the other category as one of the most overrated, and he wasn't even in the top 5, I want to say. Yeah, he wasn't, because after Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Tua, it was followed up by Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, and Brock Purdy was in there, but he was the last place, 5th place in that category with 6 votes. So for a lot of NFL players to rank him as the most underrated quarterback, I was not expecting that, just because I feel like most fans, when they watch him, feel like Brock Purdy's just a benefactor, again, of having Debo, having Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey, Kyle Shanahan as his coach. Whereas, if you look at it from a player's perspective with these votes, he's actually considered one of the most underrated quarterbacks. So I thought it was interesting, that dynamic, how it flipped. And Matthew Stafford is always included in these categories, talking about one of the most underrated quarterbacks. I think people are starting to see it now more than ever, especially seeing him in the playoffs and in that environment. But that one wasn't too surprising. And already Jordan Love, he is starting to build up a lot of hype. And to be in this category, again, not too surprising, but it was a 3-way tie with Jordan Love, Jared Goff and Kirk Cousins. So I think this one played out pretty accurately as well. Also behind those guys were Bryce Young at number 7, right outside the top 3. Then Justin Herbert and Dak Prescott as well, right behind those guys. But then lastly, the last category I thought was a pretty fun one. The quarterbacks who talk the most trash, Josh Allen again winning this category with 26 votes. Then Baker Mayfield, then Aaron Rodgers, followed up by Patrick Mahomes, CJ Stroud, and Joe Burrow. This one I think was one of the most accurate ones as well. Along with the top 3 quarterbacks, this one doesn't really surprise me. I think we know the character of all 3 of these guys, and Josh Allen responded to this on Twitter when the survey came out. Of course, he was rated the most overrated quarterback in the NFL, but he poked fun at it, saying that he was voted the most likely to trash talk out of all the quarterbacks. So I like that they included this. Baker also, knowing his personality, and also Aaron Rodgers up there as well. Not really too surprising here with these 3 guys to round out these categories, these superlatives that NFL players voted on. So I gave my thoughts, but I'd love to know what you guys think of these categories, who was voted number 1 and who wasn't included that you thought should definitely be included in these rankings. Leave your guys' thought in the comment section afterwards, or also just in the live chat as we move on with a couple more segments on today's show. One of those being the fact that Sean McVay recently named his starting running back his designated punt returner for 2024. A little bit unusual, a pretty unique decision by Sean McVay. So we're going to get into that, why he decided to name Kyren Williams that punt returner, and also the kind of options that the Rams have available to them behind Kyren Williams that makes Sean McVay so comfortable with deploying Kyren Williams as the punt returner. That is all coming up right after this break. Don't go anywhere.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
We are back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to jump straight into this pretty unique situation that the Rams and Sean McVay have gotten themselves into, not in any negative way, it's just very unusual because Sean McVay, being the head coach of the Rams, made a couple of announcements yesterday. Of course, all the final details on the final 53-man roster that every NFL team had to reduce to yesterday at the deadline at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. But also in that, you kind of order your starters in a way if you decide to do that. And one of those starters, one of the designated responsibilities for the 2024 season will be the punt returner, and that would happen to be starting running back Kyren Williams. He will be the punt returner for the Los Angeles Rams for 2024. And already, it is a little bit odd that your running back is doing that. And I'm going to get into my reasonings just after the statement that Sean McVay said on this decision. He said, it's another opportunity for him to get touches and impact the game. And you feel comfortable with that because of the confidence in Blake Corum and Ronnie Rivers being able to spell him if need be. And he mentioned two guys there, backups to Kyren Williams, obviously on the running back depth chart. But it was certainly fascinating how this all played out and the reasonings behind it as well. Because you mentioned a guy like Ronnie Rivers, he spent 2 years with the Rams already, 150 rushing yards and no touchdowns on 41 carries. So honestly, I haven't been keeping up too much with the Los Angeles Rams just in the preseason, but he might have looked good just now entering his third year with the Rams. So there could be something there that maybe most of us are just not aware of in regards to how much Ronnie Rivers can contribute to this Rams offense. And also, the bigger name is Blake Corum, just because of the notoriety he's had just based on his college career and also just the last year in college with Michigan, obviously winning the national championship. He led the FBS in rushing touchdowns, 27 in 15 games. Also recorded over 1,000 yards and 4 years at Michigan, obviously. So, more notoriety there. Antonio Navarez, thoughts on the Bears? I'm a fan of the Bears. I think right off of the bat, I haven't been keeping up with Hard Knocks or anything, but it seems like people are loving that. So the Bears, just overall, on my view of them, they're one of the teams I'm most excited to see, honestly, just on how quickly they've been able to turn their entire situation around. Keenan, DJ Moore, obviously from last year, you get your quarterback, you bring in DeAndre Swift, everything is in place. I just want to see how quickly it all turns out because I know Caleb is good, obviously. I believe he's going to be great for them. They've never had a quarterback like him, so the quicker this all turns out and how quickly they are able to put everything together is going to be an interesting journey. And when they finally do turn that corner, look out for the Bears, certainly, because they are built to be a good team, especially with that defense that doesn't get talked about enough as well. They have a lot of good players on that side of the ball as well. So, yeah, just very high on the Bears overall. I think like most people are, though. I think most people are buying into the Bears, especially with Caleb Williams. But to stick on the Rams and just this decision overall, with Blake Corum and Ronnie Rivers, obviously. The run game, though, this is obviously the biggest portion of this discussion, right? Because Kyren Williams being a designated punt returner, he is going to be out there every time, hopefully, that you make the opposing team punt on numerous occasions if you're the Rams. He's going to be out there a lot, and it's going to fluctuate throughout each game, how many times a team punts in a single game compared to other games in the regular season. But having him out there does come with a little bit of risk. Obviously, you play him more. Obviously, he is out there more, and that's great to get the ball more in his hands. But also, you don't want to stretch it too thin, right? Because as a running back, he is great. Last year, he was third in the NFL in rushing yards with over 1,100 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, second team All-Pro, and a Pro Bowl nomination as well. So he's coming off of a great year, and now you'd expect that to continue on, but you don't want to spread it too thin to now where he's also the punt returner. You want to have him out there, obviously, as much as possible on offense. So to spread him out in different areas, yeah, it's good with the reason that Sean McVay said, but also the confidence that you might have in Ronnie Rivers and Blake Corum could be up here to start the year, but how it actually plays out with how inexperienced both of these running backs are in the NFL so far will be something to keep track of, because obviously last year, they didn't have Blake Corum, and Ronnie Rivers wasn't really a viable option for the Rams. So when they didn't have Kyren Williams in 4 straight games that he was out with a sprained ankle, the Rams really struggled in the running game, only averaging 94 rushing yards per game and only scoring 2 rushing touchdowns in those 4 games that Kyren Williams was not there. So you saw the pretty negative side of it when Kyren Williams isn't out there, and he might not be out there as much anymore with, being on punt return, being a little bit more fatigued over the course of an 18, 17 game season. Those things start to add up, especially as a running back where you're asked to do a lot. He's not just in there running the ball, he's in there blocking, he's in there running routes and things like that. So all of that starts to add up, and you don't want to find yourself in a situation where Kyren gets hurt on a punt return or something like that. And then not only do you lose them in that aspect, but in the running game, now you have to overly depend on Ronnie Rivers and Blake Corum. And not to say that they're not capable of carrying the mantle, at least for a temporary amount of time, but Kyren is a very dynamic player. I think he got a lot of people's attention last year, so you want to have that available to you as much as possible. So making a decision like this isn't something that I was honestly expecting at all, but it is sort of the way that I think the new kickoff rule comes into play. Now, obviously, we're talking about punts, not kick returns or kickoffs in that matter, so there is a difference there. But I believe more teams are going to explore this opportunity, obviously, here with having some of their starters out there in the kickoff game more so than not, because I think this is just opening the door to that a little bit. Yeah, the punt game, the punt return aspect of the NFL didn't change, but I think having this new way of viewing kickoffs as a new opportunity to get yourself better field position or have more of your dynamic players out there, I think gives you more room to explore other avenues like punt returning. And now with the Rams having Kyren Williams out there, I don't think it would be crazy to see guys like Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Isaiah Pacheco, Deebo Samuel, for the Saints, Raheed Shaheed out there on kickoffs or punt returns. I think more so teams are going to be more open to doing that now, especially with the Rams sort of taking the first step in sort of changing the landscape a little bit, and everybody now seeing how the kickoffs work a little bit more and how much of an opportunity this could be offensively for these teams. I think they're going to be more willing to throw their guys out there. But of course, this decision could be subject to change. I wouldn't be surprised if they decide to go back on this at some point during the regular season. It's just how they're starting off. So you can't blame them for experimenting too much. But my biggest fear is really just spreading all your offensive players too thin, right? Because if you have Kyren Williams out there for punt return, does that open the opportunity of having somebody else out there for kickoffs potentially? I don't think they'd throw Kyren back there in both aspects. So maybe Puka back there on kickoffs or something like that, another one of your receivers on kickoffs. I don't think that's too out of the question now that you're exploring this opportunity of having your starting running back, your star running back out there for punts. So with the plethora of weapons that the Rams have as well, it might seem like a situation where you can afford to do something like this, but again, injuries happen at the worst time possible more often than not. So already having some questions with injuries just over the last few years with Cooper Kupp. Puka Nacua has been dealing with a hamstring injury this offseason and through the latter portion of training camp. So you already have those smaller issues to deal with, sort of a mini fear that you might have with those two guys potentially getting hurt. And now there could be more of an opportunity with Kyren Williams being out there on the field more often than not to potentially get hurt a little bit more. And I know that might be a pessimistic sort of way of thinking about this. Everybody could get hurt, obviously, in the NFL. That's just the nature of the game. But it's just very unusual to name your starting running back in this position. That's where, especially with this new format of kickoffs, that's where you thought an opportunity for an unknown guy, a undrafted guy, a late round draft pick to make his name through special teams, especially with how the landscape is changing. That's more so where I thought this avenue was going to take us, with discovering these unknown players and then just turning them into special team stars. But the Rams really threw a curveball in there, so, obviously no one's hoping or anything like that for Kyren to get hurt. You're wishing all the best for him because he is a great player. Big fan of him, just from last year watching him. So hopefully it all turns out well. Overall, I don't think many of us can critique Sean McVay when it comes to football. So definitely an unusual decision here, but we'll see how it pans out in their Week 1 matchup against the Detroit Lions, a rematch of one of the playoff games from last year. So it should be very exciting. And if Kyren Williams takes one back to the house using the punt return, I won't speak about it anymore. I will not question Sean McVay if that happens. But we will keep an eye on that once the regular season starts in just less than about a week now, or almost over a week now, with the NFL kicking off in a week from tomorrow. So we have that to look forward to. But in regards to this show, a couple more topics to discuss. Keeping up the series on my predictions for the final standings in each division. We're going to actually hit the NFC East this time. In regards to yesterday's show, we're going to talk about the NFC East in today's show, and also to round off this show, we're going to talk about some of the players that were placed on the physically unable to perform list to start the regular season. They will miss the first 4 weeks of the NFL. So we're going to go through that, some big players designated to that list, and just giving another round of injury updates before we close out today's episode. So a lot more to get to. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to continue on from the start of yesterday's series. I didn't get a chance to change the title of this segment, obviously, because I didn't accurately type it in yesterday. Yesterday was the NFC North, but I had it in as the NFC East. So today, we're actually going to get to talking and dissecting this NFC East division and giving my predictions on how I believe the standings will play out in 2024. I think this one, a little bit like the NFC North, where it was a little bit dicey to get through it in the middle portion of these rankings, but I think overall it wasn't too hard compared to other divisions that I will eventually get to in part of this series. So to start off, at the number 4 spot, predicting who will finish last in this NFC East, I have the New York Giants. Just basically, it is a mess almost how this situation has turned with Daniel Jones, especially getting an inside look at it with Hard Knocks. I don't think that did them any favors at all with what went into the decision making and the reasons behind it all and just how it all fell apart, honestly. And now heading into this year in 2024 with so much expectations on Daniel Jones, and still it doesn't seem like he's turned that corner. You can't have your quarterback being sometimes the reason that you do lose games. Obviously, he's not at fault for every time they lose a game or something like that, but if it happens more often than not, more often than other reasons why you lose games, it can't be something that is connected to a winning team, a team that is a contending team. So compared to the other situations, I just think the Giants could struggle with that. The inconsistency from Daniel Jones. He is a good athlete. the arm strength is pretty much there, but it's the decision-making, the telegraphing of passes that really has started to frustrate fans and the organization, it seems like, now heading into 2024. And also, just in terms of schedule, out of all the teams in the NFC East, the Giants have the toughest schedule compared to all these other teams in the division. So obviously, that's not something that benefits them too much. And the loss of Saquon obviously goes without saying. But also, the loss of Xavier McKinney on defense is another underrated loss that I was pretty confused about. So I think the Giants, it's just not really a year where you throw, if you were a betting man, a lot of money into the pot with the Giants winning this division. That's just how I see it. But moving on to the third team, we kind of got into this subject yesterday, but I decided to double down on it and predict that the Cowboys were going to finish third. Really, the biggest things that stand out to me with Dallas is the situation with Dak and his contract. It seems like he's pretty open to this year being the last year on the Dallas Cowboys for him, especially with CeeDee getting that extension before him. It makes it a little bit harder, or a lot bit harder, for them to also give Dak Prescott 58, 60 plus $60 million, especially being so close to the regular season. I feel like it's too short of a window to do that. So you can't have your quarterback on the last year of his deal and still expect, I think, better results. That's just me and how I view the contracts. And also, I mentioned the running game. They just signed Dalvin Cook. I think it was announced today or just late yesterday, but it doesn't really move me. It doesn't really move the needle to me. I'm actually going to talk about it more tomorrow in depth, but just overall, having Dalvin in there with Zeke doesn't really change my outlook on this running game, just because I think they took a step back with the talent that they have with the running backs available to them. And then also on the defensive side of the ball, you have a new defensive coordinator coming in, and you're missing Deron Bland for a good portion of the season. I don't really know, outside of Eric Kendricks, who their linebackers are going to be alongside him. Are you going to deploy Michael Parsons in there more? Are you going to keep him more as a pass rusher? I don't think he really benefits from doing both, so that's something they have to figure out. In terms of pass rushers also, they lost Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler Jr., but you might look at a guy like DeMarcus Lawrence and say that, he's still there, obviously, but he has 10 sacks in the last 2 years, 6 in 2022, and he only recorded 4 last year, so you're going to need a little bit more than that alongside Michael Parsons for this defense to continue to produce at the level that they have been producing with Dan Quinn there. Now, obviously, he is gone. You bring in Mike Zimmer. How is that transition going to go? And similarly to the Giants, the Cowboys have the second toughest schedule of all the NFC East teams. They play 8 playoff teams from last year, so that's obviously going to be a challenge if you have, a bad running game or something like that. And also on the offensive side of the ball, you get CeeDee Lamb back in there. You guarantee him for the next 4 years, something like that. But outside of him, I still have questions with Brandon Cooks as a number 2, and then you have a guy like Jalen Tolbert, hasn't really stood out over the last few years, and also a guy like Kevontae Turpin. I don't think these guys scream ideal elite number 2 receivers alongside CeeDee Lamb. And I like Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson, their tight end, is a very capable and viable weapon for them, but you need more than that at the wide receiver position, similarly to a team like the Steelers, right? You have George Pickens, you have CeeDee Lamb as your number 1s, but not a lot of people give the Steelers credit in that wide receiver room because of the lack of experience or relevancy from those other guys. So it is something that stands out, and I just feel like it's too much right now for the Cowboys to finish higher than number 2. So with that being said, the number 2 team that I predict to finish in the NFC East will be the Washington Commanders, and I might be buying in a lot on them. I might be buying a lot into their stock right now, but I just like the newness around this team. Similarly to the question I got from Antonio on the Bears, the Commanders are right there in making this quick switch, not only on the field, but in the organization, bringing in a new owner, I love Dan Quinn there as their head coach, their new general manager, Adam Peters, as well. They've really tried to flush all the negativity out of that building, out of that team, and bring in a lot of committed, good resume type of guys like Dan Quinn, like I said, their offensive coordinator, Cliff Kingsbury. He's had a good track record with mobile quarterbacks that he has had the privilege to coach, and that fits the bill with Jaden Daniels, right? Everything is going to revolve around Jaden Daniels. And just based off of what I've seen in the preseason, again, not taking too much into account with it, but just off of what everyone's saying in practice and the preseason, like I mentioned also, with Jaden, I feel like they really have something special with him, something they haven't had, honestly, since RG3, maybe Kirk Cousins, but to the level of MVP type of conversation, generational special quarterbacks. I think you get that with Jaden, and you haven't had it since RG3. But with all the good, obviously there are still some concerns, potentially with the wide receivers outside of Terry McLaurin. I just mentioned before in the previous segment that they added a guy like Noah Brown. I think that is an improvement, but again, it just doesn't do it fully for me. I feel like you need a more higher level guy, higher caliber guy than Noah Brown, Daimi Brown, or Luke McCaffrey. You know, those guys aren't awful by any means, but I just feel like with the level that you have with Jaden Daniels, he would definitely benefit a lot if you brought in somebody else. But they've added a lot just overall on all parts of this team. Their offensive line got better. Their running backs, adding Austin Eckler to Brian Robinson, is definitely an improvement. Their defensive line with Dorrance Armstrong, like I said, Dante Fowler Jr. Their linebackers with Bobby Wagner coming over as well. They definitely improved a lot. And it is interesting also with Dan Quinn, a familiar coach person just overall with that division. I think that's going to help a lot in being successful, knowing what works with certain teams and game planning, especially in how he prepares for the Cowboys, Giants, or Eagles. But I'm pretty high on the Commanders. I think they have a legitimate chance to finish second, but I just finished mentioning the Eagles, and that is who fills in that number one spot here. I do predict them to win this division, and I feel like they just have to do it, quite honestly, just because the level of talent that they have, how they crashed last year, and how it all turned pretty sour. You have those reports also of Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts sort of butting heads, and all the criticism fell on the coordinators. Their defense stunk in the last half of the year last year, so all of that wrapped up into now this year with how they've addressed almost all of it, bringing in two new coordinators, Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio, adding guys on the defensive side of the ball like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, Devin White, drafting Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, trading for a guy like Bryce Huff, and things of that nature. It's definitely something to get excited about. It's hard to predict a weak spot or just point my finger on something that is a resounding weakness of this team. It almost seems like they have everything. So with that being the case, and the standard of the Philadelphia Eagles, the reputation that they've built over the last few years, and just how they're like basically on a revenge tour from last year, I think there is no question that they have to win this division. If they don't, depending on who finishes first, I think it would turn out pretty badly for Sirianni. A lot of people have him on the hot seat already, so I think not winning the division, especially in the type of manner they might lose it in, if that were to happen, he definitely could be one to lose his job over that. Again, you can't fall short of expectations with the type of team that you have, especially so. I feel like they're in a good position to do this. They actually have the easiest schedule in the entire division. They're tied for the 21st hardest division in the NFL, so that's going to benefit them a lot more. They only play 6 playoff teams from 2023, and I think Jalen Hurts, obviously their quarterback, is going to have a better year than he did last year. I think all the turmoil and the confusion with the offensive coordinator really hurt his chances, so now this year, I think he's going to come back with a vengeance, I really do, and recover from how he performed in 2023, but that does it for the rankings. That's how I predict the NFC East will turn out. Leave your guys' thoughts on if you agree with me, you think I'm completely wrong, you think the Cowboys are going to finish first. I saw someone predict the Cowboys finishing first, which is crazy. But, just leave your guys' thoughts on how you feel the NFC East will turn out in 2024. But we do have one more segment to get to, just updating you guys on any injuries and which players will start the year on the PUP list, meaning that they will miss the first 4 weeks of the regular season. Some pretty big names on there, so we're going to go through it and their impact and their absence on their teams with being on the PUP list to start 2024. So that is coming up in just a few seconds. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining me here on the last segment of the show today. Just updating you guys on any injuries and some designations for the PUP list, meaning that some players will not be able to play in the first 4 weeks of the NFL regular season. And also, just during the break, sort of breaking news, Malik Neighbors will be wearing the number 1 jersey for the New York Giants this year. They actually unretired the number for Malik Neighbors to wear it, so pretty interesting there. I'm actually unaware of who and why they retired the number 1 jersey. Before this show ends, I will look it up and I guess provide that answer. But sort of breaking news there for some team to unretire the number 1, in this case for Malik Neighbors. Shows the kind of player that they obviously think he's going to be. But I haven't seen something like that in a while. So congratulations to Neighbors, and hopefully he can live up to it. But on this topic, the players that are designated to the PUP list, there were a couple more that were put on the PUP list after I made this segment, but we are going to focus on some of the bigger ones in this segment, starting off with the Vikings tight end TJ Hawkinson being obviously designated to the PUP list. The 27-year-old is still recovering from a torn ACL he suffered during Week 16 last year against the Detroit Lions, and at that point, I'm pretty sure the Vikings weren't really playing for too much, but it was a pretty nasty tackle that he suffered at the hands of Kirby Joseph. So it stinks that it happened in Week 16 because, again, you're right there about to finish the season, and then you have something like this happen. It was pretty devastating, especially with the kind of season that Hawkinson was having, the best of his NFL career. At that point, he finished with 95 receptions, 127 targets, and 960 yards with 5 touchdowns in 2023. Even with Kirk Cousins going down, putting up those numbers is just ridiculous. I loved it, having him on my fantasy team, but overall, with him missing the first 4 weeks of the regular season, it will mean that he will miss the games at the New York Giants in Week 1, at home versus the San Francisco 49ers, at home again against the Houston Texans, and on the road against the Green Bay Packers. The earliest he can come back will be Week 5 against the New York Jets on October the 6th. So with this happening so late in the year, yeah, it was unfortunate, but I feel like he is getting to a better spot where I do anticipate him being able to play in Week 5. I know I mentioned a different opinion with Nick Chubb yesterday, so I just feel like Nick Chubb looked a little bit worse than TJ Hawkinson, and a different position as well. Running backs definitely take a lot more wear and tear than tight ends. So I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic about Hawkinson, but that stretch of playing the 49ers, the Texans, the Packers, and potentially or missing a game against the New York Jets is definitely going to be tough to start off the year. So they're going to need him to get back as quick as possible. If he can make it by week 5, that is certainly going to soften the blow a little bit there. But that's one of them. The next player I wanted to bring up was the wide receiver for the New England Patriots, that being Kendrick Bourne, also being designated to miss the first 4 weeks of the regular season. He also tore his ACL last year during week 8, but what was interesting about this case was that at the time of tearing his ACL, he said that he should be ready to go by training camp at this point this year, obviously, but it obviously didn't turn out like that. He hasn't been in training camp, and he is still dealing with a delayed recovery, I guess you could say, from that ACL injury. So the games that he is set to miss are on the road against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 1, then at home against the Seattle Seahawks, and on the road again in week 3 against the New York Jets, and finally on the road once again against the San Francisco 49ers. The earliest game, obviously, he can come back to would be at home against the Miami Dolphins. And Kendrick Bourne, I think it is safe to say, one of their better, if not their best receiver on that team, especially with them completely resetting everything and potentially having Drake May in there or Jacoby Brissett. He is going to definitely be a position that they are going to need, a player that they're going to need at that. So the earlier he can come back, it seems like it got a little bit dicey in terms of the timeline of when they expected him to return. But by that point in time, the Patriots are in not an ideal situation, obviously, with resetting everything. Not too much expectations for this year, I would imagine, but still having him there, having him acclimated to the new quarterbacks and the new system and everything like that will be huge. So it's not so much of an urgency to have him back as much as it is to make sure he comes back fully healthy. And that way you get your whole offense together to get a better picture of what you have at your hands, at your disposal going forward, potentially after this year. So that is that for the Patriots. Another player that will definitely miss the first 4 weeks, but potentially a lot more into November, it was reported, was Kansas City pass rusher Charles Omenihu, who will remain on the PUP list to start the 2024 campaign. It is different, like I just mentioned there, because he will miss the first 4 games, but also his injury, tearing his ACL very late in the year in that AFC conference championship game against the Baltimore Ravens. That's when he tore his ACL, so he is expected to be out a little bit longer. The reports right now are saying that hopefully he comes back by November. So how they change that designation or how they affect it based on his timeline will be something to keep track of. But the way it is set up right now, he will miss those first 4 games. And also, what's also concerning, something to point out with Charles Omenihu, is that this is the last year of a 2-year deal he signed in March of 2023. So obviously last year was the first year, and now missing a good portion of the last year of that deal could affect how well he could perform, obviously in totality, by missing half of the year. So you don't want to rush him back, but also I'm sure he'll have a lot of urgency compared to someone like Kendrick Bourne in returning because of that contract situation, obviously wanting to prove himself to earn another contract with the Kansas City Chiefs. But that's pretty much the last player I wanted to mention on the PUP list. And lastly here, just as an injury update on the Houston Texans, second-year player Will Anderson. He suffered a ankle injury earlier this month, and it caused him to miss some time there recovering from that ankle injury, obviously. But head coach DeMeco Ryans recently revealed that he believes that Will Anderson is on the right path to be available for that Week 1 game against the Indianapolis Colts. Obviously, coming off of last year, winning the Defensive Rookie of the Year award, Will Anderson already is a massive part to this team. they're building a lot of what they're doing on defense based around him. Obviously going out there in the market and getting a guy like Danielle Hunter to complement, or not only complement Will Anderson, but also be a learning outlet for Will Anderson, picking his brain, a guy as successful as Danielle Hunter, and just as much as he can learn from him, basing that acquisition off of the trajectory that they have in mind for Will Anderson is going to be huge. So a little bit concerning there with an ankle injury, but he should be ready to go by week 1. And not only him, he is part of that young nucleus that the Texans have at their disposal with their draft classes and how well they've been able to turn this situation around. So Will Anderson in year 2, he performed very well in year 1, but the expectations now that you have in year 2, especially with the kind of expectations that this Texans team has as a whole, he's certainly going to have to play a big part in that if they are to go anywhere with this team. And then lastly, just quickly here, staying with pass rushers, the Seattle Seahawks pass rusher Uchenna Nwosu will be sidelined for about 2 to 6 weeks because of a sprained MCL that he suffered in the last preseason game for the Seahawks, which is the last thing you want to do, obviously, having your starters out there. I'm sure not too long, but having one of them get injured. It led to Nwosu suffering that sprained MCL, and based on the timeline, 2 to 6 weeks at this point puts him in real question to miss that week 1 game for the Seattle Seahawks, which is definitely a blow, not just because Nwosu, I believe, is a good player when healthy. He has struggled with staying on the field recently, but the Seahawks were already low in terms of depth at that position, so not having him on top of already being short with Nwosu in the lineup is definitely going to hurt, and it is only a short injury, just 2 to 6 weeks, but with a sprained MCL, with anything that's sprained, it's always a little bit tricky in gauging the timeline on any player coming back. So Nwosu will most likely, if I were to predict, won't be there for that week 1 game for the Seattle Seahawks, which is unfortunate, obviously, but it is what it is now. Hopefully he comes back quicker. The quicker the better is actually what I meant to say for the Seattle Seahawks. I think there's a lot of anticipation with the Seahawks as well, with new head coach Mike Macdonald there, especially on the defensive side, and Nwosu would and should be a big part of that. So he's going to be certainly missed, but the quicker he comes back will benefit the Seattle Seahawks team a lot. But that's pretty much it. That's all I had for you guys on today's show. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, as well as following the network on all forms of social media. If you want to check out more content around this show, check out the GSMC Podcast and the GSMC Sports Network channels on YouTube for a lot more content revolving around the NFL in a lot different forms of media and content on both of those channels. And lastly, to catch more live shows at your disposal, tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more NFL storylines, discussions, and everything with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you for joining me once again. I hope to have you guys back on here live with me again tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't